others will enter whilst I'll give my opening words. So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the annual ialeUK Bunce Lecture, followed by our annual meeting. Just a quick word of housekeeping, and that's that we'll be recording this webinar. I don't know whether Caitlin has hit recording yet, but if you don't want to be seen on the recording, then make sure that you don't have your camera on. And if you don't want anyone else to ever see what you write in the chat, then don't write anything in the chat. So anything you share during the meeting could become public. My name is Mark Metzger. I'm the president of ialeUK, and I'm helped here today by Caitlin Lewis, who's our early career rep, and dealing with all the technical things and all the bleeps that are happening with people entering the webinar. ialeUK is the UK region of the International Association for Landscape Ecology. And landscape ecology is a holistic discipline that looks at the interactions across space and time between the structure and the function of physical, biological, and cultural components of landscapes. And of course, hedgerows are one of those physical, biological, and cultural components. They combine all these elements together and make a great theme for our webinar today. ialeUK has been promoting landscape ecology in the UK since 1992. And Bob Bunce has helped establish ialeUK and led iale for a long time as president or chair. And after his passing a couple of years ago in 2022, we decided to organize an annual lecture in his memory. And we'd learned from the pandemic that webinars are a really good way to reach a wide audience in an accessible and cost-efficient way. So we've been, this is our third Bunce lecture. And we do this preceding our annual meeting with the idea that there might be a few people who want to stick around to listen to what we've been doing in the last year and to hear about our plans for the year going forward. So anyone who feels like sticking around is welcome to stay for the annual meeting at the end of today's session. Caitlin, could you move to the next slide? So our rough plan, if it was Bob, it would be a very firm plan, would be to start in a minute's time, have a half-hour keynote lecture by Lisa, followed by a panel discussion. We're very pleased that we have a diverse panel, including Nigel, an active practicing hedgelayer, Emma, who works at the Countryside Charity and has been a very active activist for hedgerows, and Jaques Baudry, an eminent experienced landscape ecologist who probably wrote the first ever paper about hedgerows and connectivity in the context of landscape ecology. After their reflections, we have half an hour of Q&A where you all have the opportunity to ask questions, either by writing them in the chat or by raising your hand, and we'll let you speak. And we'll definitely end at 4:30 and no later, have a very short break, and then we'll have our annual meeting. Could you go to the next slide, Caitlin? So before handing over to Lisa, I just wanted to share this short reflection from Bill Bryson, written in his book, Notes from a Small Island, which I think provide a very nice introduction to today's lecture. So Bill, who also was the president of the Countryside, of Emma's organization, which has been rebranded the Countryside Charity. He is obviously an established writer, wrote a very nice book about his reflections about the UK and walking around the UK. And so he wrote about hedgerows in his chapter 13 when he was in the Cotswolds. It's easy to forget in a landscape so timeless and fetching, so companionably rooted to an ancient past, how easily it is lost. The panorama before me incorporated electricity pylons, scattered housing estates, and the distant sunny glids of cash and carry warehouses. Far worse, the dense, carefully knitted network of hedgerows was showing distinct signs of becoming frayed and disjointed. Here and there, fragments of overgrown hedge stood stranded and forlorn in the midst of otherwise featureless fields. Between 1984 and 1990, despite the withdrawal of government money to plough up hedgerows, a further 53,000 miles were lost. You often hear it said, and I know because I once spent 3 days at a symposium on hedgerows, the things I do to keep my children in Reeboks. Well, that symposium and that figure was a countryside survey symposium, possibly even an ialeUK meeting, I'm not sure. But that figure of 53,000 miles lost is the outcome of, or the finding of the 1990 countryside survey, or one of the findings. Bob Bunce, who for whom we're dedicating these lectures, he established a countryside survey in the late 1970s. So it's very nice that in this sort of popular book, The Reflection on the Importance of Hedgerows, the data that was collected by Bob, and then now to pass over to Lisa to give this year's Bunce Symposium lecture. Caitlin, you can stop sharing and maybe Lisa can start sharing her screen whilst I introduce her. Lisa is a landscape ecology at UKCEH, has been involved in the countryside survey and many things hedgerow for a long time, and has also worked with Bob previously, so a very fitting speaker for today's lecture. So it's my pleasure to hand over to Lisa, and I look forward to hearing what you have to tell us, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, sorry, I look slightly older than that photo. That was probably nearer the time of the last survey in 2007. Yeah, it's a real privilege to be asked to do this. And I'm going to talk about the future, whether the future is looking bright for hedgerows in the UK. And I have to say that while I would love it to have been about the UK, it is about parts of the UK and not all of it, and with a big emphasis on England. And so I will try to inform you as much as I can about the other bits, but the main emphasis is on England. And as always in these things, it's not just me. There are a big team of people who work with me on this work. Just some of them are listed there. And big thanks also to Bob Bunce, without whose vision, as Mark has said, this work would never have happened. And many of us remember him as a colleague and are very grateful for what he's done for ecology in the UK, and particularly for monitoring. So yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to talk about something that Bob was responsible for, really. So I'm just going to start off with just talking about the focus on hedges in the UK, because they seem to have been very popular just in the last few years, which obviously for somebody who really values hedges, that's a great thing. So I've just a few different organisations that I've harvested things off their website just today, and they include the CPRE, who Emma's going to talk to us later, but they've done 2 very influential reports recently, and they have hedgerow projects ongoing. And as well as that, the Woodland Trust, they have ongoing funding for new hedges. They're also very interested in the future of hedgerows, and you can see that they really value the ecosystem services provided by hedges in all sorts of different ways. Also, I've got the People's Trust for Endangered Species, slightly obscured by HedgeLink, but the People's Trust for Endangered Species have been a real champion of hedgerows in recent years. They took on HedgeLink management for a while, and I'll tell you a little bit more about HedgeLink in a second. But PTES I read an article in Farmers Weekly by Megan Gimber from there just a few weeks ago, very actively promoting hedges. They've also promoted a sort of volunteer survey of hedgerows in recent years, of which quite a number of kilometres of hedges just over 900 have been surveyed. HedgeLink at the bottom there is the group that was originally pulled together to look after the priority habitat of hedgerows, and that group has stayed together, and that represents the whole of UK, not just England, and all sorts of partners from all different areas. And as you'll see, they're very up to date with what's going on in hedgerows. But other groups that have been interested in hedgerows include the NFU, who had a report on hedgerows not very long ago, a couple of years ago, and are particularly interested in farmers' aspects in terms of how they can increase biodiversity and help farmers meet net zero targets. CAFRE, the College of Agriculture, Food and Rural Enterprise, really important in Northern Ireland for advising farmers. I've been talking to them about climate-friendly hedges and their carbon capture. And then there are private businesses also coming into the picture now around carbon offsetting, unlocking the power of hedgerows in the UK. So they really are a very current and important issue, which is great if you're an ecologist. So back to the countryside survey. So the GB countryside survey, as Mark said, it started in 78, and then the surveys in 1984, 1990, 98 and 2007 all included quite a large hedgerow component, which I'll talk about. There is a countryside survey ongoing. It's a smaller survey, and it mainly looks at plots rather than the mapping that is done in a more traditional survey. But that programme is ongoing at the moment, and there are plots on hedgerows being sampled. The one I'm mainly going to talk about now is the 22-23 in blue there. That's England only. So that's a full survey of the square, not a full survey, but a survey of the hedgerows in those squares. There are also other surveys going on that are sort of very linked, highly linked to the countryside survey, and include some of the squares of the countryside survey. And they include a Welsh programme, the Glassdeer Monitoring and Evaluation Programme, which took place in 2013 to 16, that kind of filled the gap between 2007 to now, and the Environment and Rural Affairs Monitoring and Modelling Programme, ERAMP. And that's sort of completing now and going into a new phase. But as I said, that survey has included hedgerow monitoring. The Northern Ireland Countryside Survey was last done in 2007, like the GB one, and we've just completed work there. UKCEH I'm leading that one, and that has just completed work in the last couple of years. Well, just this year, in fact. So we haven't got any results yet, but there will be some results on Northern Ireland hedges coming in the near future. The project that actually funded this survey was a Natural England funded project, and they were interested particularly in whether the agri-environment schemes had a good effect on hedges, beneficial effect on hedges. And so they felt that it was really important to have a repeat survey, so they understood the context in which those agri-environment schemes were operating, and also to look at whether we could find areas where agri-environment schemes had or hadn't made a difference. And that project was quite broad. It included other aspects, including a farmer contractor survey, and I'll just say a little bit about that in the talk. So as Bill Bryce, and I didn't expect that, has already pointed out, the research has been really valuable for policy. So the introduction of the hedgerow regs in 1997 were highly linked to the countryside survey evidence base, which had shown that hedgerows were disappearing. And in England, the law stops that happening. You can't actually dig out a hedgerow without derogation. It's not the same in the other UK countries, but it is in England. And more recently, my colleague Joe Staley and Rob Walton and I have been involved in defining the favourable conservation status for hedgerows in England. And you'll see a very ambitious 61% increase is proposed for them to be in favourable conservation status. So as well as policy impact, Countryside Survey also has a lot of scientific impact, and that is why it is currently funded by the Research Council, as opposed to when it was previously funded by both DEFRA and the Research Councils. And the kind of papers that have come out have looked at the extent to which hedges are refugia for plants, relationships between heterogeneity across landscapes and how that influences botanical richness, for example, and hedgerows are part of that work. Some work with Nigel Critchney that looked at functionally classifying different herbaceous flora underneath hedges in order to try and help set restoration objectives. So if you wanted to restore a hedge, what did you want it to be looking like? And then articles like this one from the Journal of Applied, which looked at promotion of pollinator abundance resulting from the presence of hedgerows on the land. So that was just really to say where Countryside Survey has been used and why it's important both scientifically and for policy. It's just something about the way it works. So this is the website actually, if you ever want to go and have a look, and it just shows there are a whole set of reports and access to papers, etc., on that website. But the basic underlying premise of Countryside Survey is that if you divide the country up into land classes, which are similar, so each 1 kilometre square in Great Britain was allocated to a land class based on sort of underlying characteristics of the land, so not actually the habitats, but the underlying geology, soil type, altitude, those kind of things. And so each land class consists of squares which have relative similarity amongst those feature types. And within the aim is, because you can't go everywhere and look at absolutely everything, people think you can do it from EO data, and you can to a certain extent, but it doesn't necessarily give you the actual detail you need. The idea was, let's go and sample a number of squares in each land class and see what information that gives us in a statistically robust way. And that was Bob's idea. He trialled it in Cumbria first, and then he went national. And so the survey started in 1978 with just 256 squares, and you can see it increased over time with policy interest and with interest in looking at all sorts of different things. In 2007 we had 591 squares, and that allowed us to provide a report for Scotland, a report for England, and a report for Wales, as well as an overall GB report. This survey, the results of which I'm going to talk about now, are all from 22-23 and from the 248 squares which sample England. And what do we collect in the squares? So one aspect of the data is to map. So this has obviously got significantly more digitized as we've gone forward. So 2007 was the first digital mapping, and then this time we're out with a very advanced software which you can use on an iPad or a sort of tablet, nice light thing to carry, and you can basically get your data straight into the database from the field, which is pretty amazing considering how long it used to take to digitize such data from paper maps. But what we map is every single linear feature, and we map in classes. So whether a feature is a managed hedge, and that's the surveyors record whether or not the lines of trees or shrubs take their natural shape, so whether the trees or shrubs in those features take a natural shape, or they're a line of trees or shrub in which they don't take their natural shape. So the managed hedge is the one where they don't, and the line of trees or shrub is the one where they do. And these definitions seem very pedantic, but if you actually want to measure change between these different types, you need quite a pedantic definition. the feature type. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to record that sort of thing. So for managed hedges, we record a variety of information, length and location, the height of the base of canopy, important to define whether it's a hedge or not, species composition, and some management information, as well as vertical gappiness. And then for the lines and trees and shrubs, some similar categories, as well as the modal diameter at breast height of each of the trees, what type of trees they are, but also a historical management code. So when you're looking at a line of trees, has it always been a line of trees? Is there evidence that it was previously managed as a hedge? And these pictures maybe help a bit with that. So on the left is the more, so if I go into, if we hadn't had this quite tight definition, it'd be very easy for two different surveyors to go in a field with a very different idea of what a hedge is or isn't, and record it as a hedge. and that doesn't help us if we're looking at change between the feature types. So the ones on the left are pretty traditional managed hedges, one in the winter, one in the spring. And then the features on the right are different. So the top feature would be recorded as a line of trees by a surveyor, but on close inspection, and I know because I think I took the photo, you would have a look and you would see that there are laid stems across the bottom of that feature, and signs of historic management. So in all likelihood that was a hedge previously, it just isn't anymore. The bottom feature looks like a line of rocks by the road, but that is they're coppiced stools. So the trees there have been totally coppiced, and that also qualifies as a managed hedge, not one in which trees take their natural shape, but surveyors would also record that. Here's two more features. I just overlaid the bottom two photos. So the one on the left, not the trees in the foreground, but the trees in the background are hawthorn trees, and they are kind of taking their natural shape. It's a blurry line, this, but they are taking their natural shape. There is a laid stem across the bottom there. They're also on a bit of a bank, but that's a feature which was obviously a managed hedge in the past and is now turning into a line of trees. The feature on the right at the bottom there is a bank with a couple of trees on, and they're hawthorn trees. That wouldn't get recorded as either type of feature, but it's pretty clear that probably was a hedge in time. Those individual trees would just be recorded. So there's change between all sorts of feature types going on in the countryside, and the Countryside Survey is doing its best to try and pick that up. We also do some vegetation plots, and they're places on the hedges where we do a lot of detailed measures. The D plots sample the woody vegetation, and they've been done since '98. The plots which sample under the hedge, the vegetation under and adjacent to the hedge, have been done since 1978, right from the beginning. So when we went out in the survey in the last couple of years, we did some D plots and some H plots associated with them on hedges that we've been looking at, some of them since '78, but we also looked at some specific hedges which we knew were under agri-environment schemes, so that we could give Natural England the kind of information that they were looking for. So the woody feature plots, the D plots, are 1 by 30 metres, and they sample the woody component. And HedgeLink, the group I referred to earlier, that used to be the Priority Habitat group, in 2007 they came up with a list of features or a list of data variables that they felt contributed to hedge condition. So they included the height at a minimum of 1 metre. We've talked about whether that should be higher, because that isn't a very high hedge. The width at a minimum of 1.5 metres, and that results in a cross-sectional area of a minimum of 3 metres squared. So if a hedge has a cross-sectional area of that size, it's considered to be in good condition. Other aspects are that it's less than 10% of gaps across the hedge. This hedge wouldn't have any gaps because it has actually got probably an elder there in the middle, but it's not leaving a gap where the sun can shine basically straight down to the ground. The height of the base of the canopy, so where the woody plants are branching out right at the bottom, that is part of the hedgerow condition definition, that it's branching at less than 5 meters, 0.5 meters, sorry. And then there's the width, the margin criteria. So there should be at least 2 meters of undisturbed ground, and at least 1 meter of that should be perennial herbaceous vegetation. One more condition criteria is that it shouldn't be a recently introduced, consist of recently introduced species. So these are the condition assessment criteria that we look at when we go through the D plots. The hedge plots, the hedge base plots, these are the ones that have been in the survey for a long time, and they come 1 meter out from the centre of the hedge, and they just look at species cover and anything else that's at the base of the hedge. The HedgeLink did consider, should we have some aspect of this in the condition criteria, because they're very often these days dominated by nettles, cleavers, thistles and dock, but there isn't actually a condition criteria in there, but still this is part of the countryside survey measures. So just to step aside briefly, the contract was looking at how agri-environment schemes have impacted on hedgerow condition, and these are some pictures of the agri-environment data in the last since 2007 essentially, and the 4 maps just show cut-off time periods. So in 2007, each 5 years, 2012, 2017 and 2022, the agri-environment data is quite difficult to work with, and so it was easier to look at these times and see what schemes were present on the land. That was the easiest way to work with this, and you'll see that the scales go from less than 5% for the yellow to over 60 for the purple, and that means that's the percentage of total hedgerow extent under AES management. So if you look at 2007 and particularly 2012, this is when we had the entry-level scheme, where we were broad and shallow, it was called, try and get as many farmers in as possible. So many of the farmers came in on hedgerow options. After this time, there was a review of the schemes and of their effectiveness of those options, and we went to a different scheme called the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, and that encouraged more significant actions than just the managing in every 2 years, and it was available for far fewer farmers. So the proportion of hedges under scheme went right down by 2022. But, oops, sorry, getting ahead of myself, but the options for restoration and planting were 2 of the options that came in for the 2022 data point. And if you look at the yellow, you might think it's the same scale as previously. As I said, it was less than 5 yellow in the previous slide and greater than 60 for the purple. In this case, for the restoration options, it's less than 1 for the yellow, and it's 4.6 to 8% for the purple. So much lower proportion of hedges in those schemes, restoration, and much lower for planting, as you'd expect, less than 0.02 for the yellow and between 0.05 and 0.08 for the purple. But you can see that the amounts are much lower, as you would expect in reality, but they're also quite regionally different. So different parts of the country are going into these different scheme types, and that's one of the things we've looked at in relation to some of the results. So what did we find? This is the total length of hedgerows trend. So to 2007, we were seeing declines, and you can see that the new point is still on the declining trend. That's our length of hedges. So the scale goes from 500 down to around 400, bit below. This is the lines of trees. So the increasing length of lines of trees up to 2007 is still increasing. We have much bigger error bars on that last point, as you'll see. But the scale is, you know, we're starting at 50 for the lines of trees and ending around 150. So there's fewer lines of trees than there are lengths of managed hedges. We did those differences from 2007 to 2023, although they look quite high in that table, were not significant on their own. And we think that's partly due to that large error bars, and that may be due to differences in permissions. So as we've gone on with Countryside Survey since 78, when you probably could get access to all land, in the more recent surveys it's been more difficult to get access to land. We visited all the squares, and we do believe that we are sampling an adequate proportion of the land in the squares, but it is definitely less than we used to, and that creates higher variability. But overall, that picture isn't a great one. We're seeing continued declines in the lengths of managed hedges and continued increase in lines of trees, a bit like the one in that photo there. So what do we see in terms of heights of features? So the big dark blue area is where the features are greater than 2 meters, and that's promising. That's definitely bigger in 2023 than it was in the other two surveys. And it mainly seems to be those that are between 1 and 2 meters that are getting bigger. So this actually was a significant shift between those categories, from the 1 to 2 meters to the greater than 2 meters. In terms of management types, the sort of lighter blue, which is dominating the chart there, is the cutting, e.g. with the flail or a saw, in less than 3 years. And that proportion of hedges has got higher, and it's got higher at the expense of no recent management or newly planted, which is interesting and perhaps a bit surprising, but that's what we found. So we did look. I haven't got very many results for the individual land classes. So obviously we get results for each of those land classes, which you saw underlying the sampling regime. And we found, we have looked at those, and we found that the biggest losses are in the eastern land classes. And you may remember from the agri-environment scheme maps that actually those are areas where restoration and planting is happening. So that was a reasonably nice finding for Natural England, that they at least appear to be hitting the areas where they do need some work. So the other results from the H plots, that's the plots at the base of the hedge. This isn't a very nice looking H plot. It appears to be badger dug and with nettles, but unfortunately quite a lot of them aren't very nice in terms of their species diversity, the numbers or types of species that you tend to find. And this is only a one species decline, but that is a significant loss over time. With the number of plots that we look at, significant loss both between 2007 and 22 and in the longer term trend. So we were looking for Natural England at whether the agri-environment schemes have had any effect, and you're seeing that we did record higher hedges in this survey. We also found that the agri-environment schemes, which in this chart are the blue and the green lines, showed that hedges were a bit higher, just 0.2 of a metre, and it was significant, but they were a bit higher than those in the schemes, which is shown with the red line. So you'll remember all those condition criteria that we looked at. And so what did they look like? So the proportion of D plots for which managed hedges reached 9 criteria are shown here with the various criteria. And you can see slightly higher, slightly wider. For example, the gappiness is less into 2023, so that's a good sign. Things like the amount of undisturbed ground, it's pretty low, as you can see there. So I've summarised the results here. So in 2007, around about 50% of hedges reached structural condition, and so that's to do with the woody component. So that's how high, how wide, how gappy, primarily. In 2023, that got a bit better, and that's partly because we saw height increases and width increases. So 55% of hedges were reaching structural condition. And it seems that the agri-environment scheme hedges were in better structural condition than those not under the schemes, so 63%. When we looked at all condition criteria, so that includes the margins, it was less than 50% of those agri-environment scheme hedges that reached all those condition criteria. And if you look at arable land specifically, it's just 17% of hedges reach all the condition criteria. So we're a fairly long way off where we would have liked to be in terms of the condition of the hedges. So we did look specifically at some of the planting up. Where were the newly planted features? Did the surveyors record them? Because they have the ability to record a newly planted code. They did in 19.5 kilometres. That's not a great proportion of the amount of hedges we recorded. And we found that 12 kilometres of those had actually they were there as managed hedges in 2007. So only about 7.5 kilometres were brand new hedges, and the others were gapped up hedges where there was new planting, but it wasn't the entire length of the hedge as is shown in this picture. We also found that there were 210 new features, and they sort of were over 20 kilometres in length. They weren't recorded as newly planted, but they were there, and they weren't there last time. And so they're obviously hedges that have grown to a reasonable size, and so much so that the surveyors couldn't tell that they were new hedges since 2007, and that can quite easily happen with a hedge. They can grow very rapidly. What we found were that only 1% of those 179 planted features were under agri-environment schemes, and only 10% of those new features that we found and hadn't seen before were in areas under agri-environment scheme. So it seems that lots of the features that are coming in the newly planted features are not coming in under agri-environment schemes. And indeed, when we spoke to the farmers and the contractors in our surveys, new planted had often taken place under schemes like the Woodland Trust Scheme, the Tree Council, other charitable schemes rather than under government funding. So in terms of hedgerow restoration, I think Nigel might have some things to say about restoration and rejuvenation, but there isn't an option for hedgerow rejuvenation in the schemes. There is one for restoration, and a higher proportion of hedges under restoration showed signs of coppicing and laying than those under management. So this means that there is something happening on those hedges, but we also found that those under restoration options did tend to be less structurally sound and had wider margins. So I think that because 2022 was the time period we chose to look at hedges, but some of those hedges would have been entered in 2021, and therefore the actions may not have actually happened yet. You would expect them to be less structurally sound and therefore needing the work for which they were being paid. So it seemed like those hedges were either had started management or they needed it. So overall, the results indicated that hedgerow condition improved somewhat between 2007 and 22-23, and that the agri-environment schemes had a small positive impact on condition. But they were falling short of the 95% of features in good condition that were being aimed at for favourable conservation status. And to be honest, there are no signs that the schemes are significantly impacting on hedgerow extent. So just one slide on the farmer contractor surveys. It was very clear from the surveys that both farmers and contractors really value hedges and their benefits. They were wanting to manage them well in both cases. It was very interesting to actually work with the contractors, who are the key managers. They're responsible for more hedge management than farmers, although they primarily cut rather than doing any in the other activities. Although less than 40% said they'd been involved in either gapping up, coppicing or laying. Yes, we've had a very good interaction with the contractors and learnt a lot about what they do, why they do it, how they do it, which I think will be very useful when considering schemes. In terms of farmer hedge restoration, laying and coppicing, the participants who are not in current schemes were much less likely to have ever restored a hedge. So we asked surveyors, we asked the farmers, have you ever done it? And 37 of the farmers we asked had never done any coppicing or laying on their hedgerows on their farm. And then you can see the numbers there. The 36 compared to the 22 were the number who had done some coppicing and laying recently. So the survey just showed us really that there was a significant proportion of farmers who haven't ever done it on their farm, and also a more significant proportion who have. Despite that, we're not really picking it up in the survey, not very commonly anyway. So a quick look at the other parts of the UK. So for Wales, so this comes from the Glacier Monitoring and Environment Programme and was reported in the State of Natural Resources report for Wales in 2020. There seemed to be shorter hedges. So 60% of their hedges were in the shorter 1 to 2 metre category. But the width of the hedges had increased between 2007 and 2016, meaning that they came out as a slight improvement in overall condition. Their ground flora richness in their hedges actually increased in 2007 to 2016, as opposed to in England. And their hedge length, they pretty much were having the same trends as England, so more lines of trees and less managed hedges. Although their changes between 2007 and 2016 were not significant. It was the trends that were significant, as in England. For Scotland, we've had no data since 2007. This worries me slightly because Scotland was the country which saw the most significant decreases up to 2007. But we don't know what's happening in Scotland at the moment. And Northern Ireland, as I've already said, the surveyors have been out this year and last, and the results will be coming out by 2026. There's quite a lot of work to do on the analysis there. So what next? I think the results just really show a significant increase in efforts to plant, restore and rejuvenate is required to turn the tide on this continuing loss in hedgerows. And I think we're up against it to a certain extent, just even in the last day or 2 days, it's farmers who are going to be doing this, and they're up against quite a lot already in terms of rapid phase out announced for these basic payment scheme, the protests against inheritance tax, which we've seen farmers making just in the last few days, the concerns about losing land because they have very large taxes. And then yesterday, the capital grants part of the current SFI scheme has been temporarily closed. And that's the grant which will help farmers restore and plant. It's not about management, but it is about restoration and planting. So it's a very difficult picture. Farming is a difficult picture, and farmers are responsible for our hedges. So I'm afraid it's not a great news story. We're very grateful that we have a survey that can show us what's been happening, and it's now time to think about where we go to change things. Thank you very much for listening. We can't hear you, Mark, sorry.
Thank you, Lisa. Not the nicest final slide and reflections to have there. But I was speaking to Nigel just before we started the meeting, one of our panelists, who was saying that he is very busy in planting and restoring hedgerows as an experienced hedge layer. So he's one of our panelists, and I'd like Nigel to maybe be the first one to reflect on Lisa's talk and tell us a bit about your experience.
Thank you very much, Mark. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, very good.
So yes, quite a lot to say really, but first of all, congratulations to Lisa and her team for absolutely marvellous work. And I know personally I've been looking forward so much to getting these results, so that's absolutely fantastic. So first of all, just my sort of quick fire thoughts, and working on the ground, as it were, all over the country, you know, it always amazes me that surveys do actually reflect what's going on, and it's refreshing to see that. It's interesting, for example, that in the West Country, more restoration, and I'm going to come back to that word restoration, of course, as Lisa suggested, more restoration options are being taken up. And that's obviously because of these small field systems, the more sort of bocage area of landscape there, and smaller ownerships, people involved in their hedgerows, while the East has more planting, which is somewhat ironic, of course, because the hedges there were often in the worst condition and in fact show the greatest losses over many, many years. So that's an interesting dynamic, what's going on in the East. The amount of laying in coppicing figures is up slightly. I mean, that's to the credit of the environmental schemes, I think, and a lot of hedge layers work is through those schemes, although maybe it's because of where I live in Oxfordshire, but a lot of the work I do is by private people actually not involved in schemes. So that figures up, that's good, but also with the amount of hedges being trimmed. Trimmed is a bit often a euphemism for, you know, cut really, really hard. And that chunk of hedgerows that's being cut really, really hard and indeed being over managed is up. So I would ask the question, where's the future rejuvenation? And I've already introduced that word rejuvenation. I prefer to use the word rejuvenation, not restoration. I'll come back to that. But, you know, in order to rejuvenate hedges, certainly laying, you have to let the hedges grow up to a height, often sort of 4 meters or more. Same with coppicing often, if you want wood fuel from it. You know, you want your hedges to be slowly going up in time, moving through a life cycle. And if the vast majority of hedges are being trimmed really quite hard, you know, that is bottling up a pressure for the future, really, I suppose. The amount of coppicing and laying we can see is still extremely low. Like, I mean, literally, it seems to me that it's barely 1%, possibly a bit more. To the point where, you know, that's almost insignificant. We need to be rejuvenating our hedgerows far more. Like, this is the answer to everything in my mind. We have to have this continuous life cycle of a hedge where it's I won't put a figure on it, but every 30-40 years, whatever it is, to rejuvenate the hedge, to refresh it, as it were, reset it, and on we go. And that's a very small amount. It's still, I suppose, disappointing that the figure for favourable condition remains around about 50%. That's, I don't know, I suppose it's okay. Could do better in a school report, I suppose it would say. Only 63% of hedges under the agri-environment scheme management were in structural condition. That's somewhat disappointing. One would have thought if they were in the agri-environment schemes, they would be on top of and improving their condition. Above 63%, I would have thought. Interesting to see also that so many hedges are being planted outside of schemes. It reflects in my workload. I don't know whether that is a reflection of just wealthy landowners who don't need the grant, or as some landowners say, the farmers say, you know, just can't be doing with the paperwork, and so we just do it ourselves, kind of thing. Quick note on the Welsh figures there. The figures showing a decrease in laying and coppicing. I think that very much reflects the fact that over the last decades, the payment for rejuvenation has been woefully low, although they have just put that up in fairness, but that wouldn't be reflected in these figures. What to do? Just thoughts on that, really. Recently I came up, well, I think I can claim a bit of credit for it, with the idea of incremental trimming. So that is when this trimming takes place, this trimming on the hedges takes place, I'm trying to encourage farmers to just back out a little bit, to come off this hard dimensions, as it were, just ever so slightly increase every time, which gives us more berries and blossom, etc. It's called incremental trimming. It's in the new sustainable farming incentive. I think that will make a change in the future, hopefully, as hedges are allowed to breathe, are allowed to go up in size very, 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 very gradually, and then eventually be rejuvenated. And yes, farmers will especially do this if they know they pretty well certain of getting a grant in the future to rejuvenate them, which is all about this life cycle of the hedges. Rejuvenation, I use this word, it's about resetting the hedge, starting off this life cycle again, whilst you've got a high density of stems. To me, that's the important condition of hedgerows, is having lots of stems in a hedge, and then you have options for future management. So rejuvenation, I'll say it time and time again, is the most important action I think we can take to improve condition and increase structural variety, because of course across a landscape, if you have a cycle of that going on, you'll have some short hedges, some tall hedges, some hedges in between, providing all those niches, ecological niches that are necessary. I was in Lincolnshire giving a talk 2 days ago. Lincolnshire's well known for being a very flat, very intensively arable landscape. I was amazed how many hedges there were there. Actually, it's quite amazing, but they are all the same structure. All being trimmed at about roughly 1.5 meters, something like that, box-shaped things, all of them exactly the same. And one farmer I talked to had 98 kilometers of hedge on his farm. That's a lot of hedge to be looking after on one farm. Large farms up there, mainly all hawthorn, and this is a big difference to me. It goes back to the West Country versus the main central England. These are the enclosure hedges, purely hawthorn very often. They, to me, in my mind, should be the target hedgerows for improving, because they cannot withstand this constant trimming to the same height. They're just single or narrowly planted lines of hawthorn, and they're to me are in really bad condition, and they should be the target. And if we were to jump into the future by 40 or 50 years, I think they will definitely be the ones which are starting to disappear even more than they are now, because I think that's where a lot of hedges have disappeared. So I love Lisa's final little quote at the end there, that we need a significant increase in efforts to plant, restore and rejuvenate hedges to turn the tide on continuing hedgerow loss. And so we've got 3 words there. We've got the planting, which is self-evident, the restoration, which is refilling gaps, making the hedges more dense, getting something back that is almost lost and getting it back into something we can at least call a hedge. And then we've got rejuvenation, which is a natural part of the life cycle of a hedge, where every 30, 40, 50 years, we take it back down. All the stems are healthy. We know they're going to come back up, and that creates this mosaic of habitats across the country. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nigel, and perfectly kept to time. We'll then move over to our second panelist, Emma Marrington, who's an experienced campaigner and landscape enhancement lead at CPRE, the Countryside Charity. Emma.
Hi, thank you. So yes, I'm Emma Marrington at CPRE, the Countryside Charity. Some of you may know us as our former name, Campaign to Protect Rural England. So a bit of background about CPRE. So we have groups in every English county, including several who are involved in our local Hedgerow Heroes project. So that's to plant and restore hedgerows. I should also say there are a couple of groups, such as I see Jaques here from Friends of the Lake District, who have a landscape enhancement grant, which again is looking at not only hedgerows but wider countryside enhancement too. So I cover a wide range of issues at CPRE, including obviously hedgerow policy. Hedgerows, as we all know, are icons of the landscape. They lend beauty and character, and they're something that makes home, creates home to us, that sense of place. CPRE began our campaign for hedgerow protection in the 1970s and welcomed the hedgerows regulations, which Lisa mentioned, in 1997. And so that is supposed to protect, if they are under threat, hedgerows that are important within the landscape. So mostly countryside hedgerows. And there's like very stringent criteria, but more about that later. And so this is the first statutory protection for important hedgerows. And at CPRE, as Lisa was mentioning, we've had various reports about hedgerows, including one about the hedgerows regulations, I'll talk about later, the recommendations, the environmental and economic benefits of hedgerows, farming and hedges, so that's a survey of over 1,000 farmers and what their views were on hedges, and then also looking at opportunities to increasing hedgerows around England. So more about that in a moment as well. So thoughts on Lisa's brilliant presentation. As Nigel said, fantastic to see these results coming out. So I was looking at the slides showing the change in the percentage of hedgerows, the extent under management options. And as Lisa picked out, the notable change, particularly between 2012, where it looked as though the higher percentage of hedgerows were under the farming schemes, and 22, the majority, was between 16 to 30% coverage. As Lisa said, the entry-level encouragement of take-up in 2012, was a key part of that. And when I was looking at the results, seeing the take-up of hedgerow restoration options under the agri-environment schemes is variable and obviously a low percentage, but the planting looked to be more popular. Obviously, the percentages are different there, the scales. But with newly planted hedgerows, obviously they're going to see management over the long term. And so targeted commitment to do this is very important. So, for example, landowner agreements. And as Nigel also observed, it's very interesting to see the biggest loss of hedgerows in eastern landscapes, but there's an area with a higher amount of planting under the schemes. And as we know, many hedgerows are being planted outside of agri-environment schemes, as mentioned before. And so the example of CPRE's contribution via our Hedgerow Hero project. So, for example, we're in the phase 4 of that this year, and we've got 8 groups who are working with local partners to actually create planting of new hedgerows and hedge laying, gapping up, etc. So it's really good we have those projects on the ground. So how might we be able to better protect and restore hedgerows? So at CPRE, we campaigned for a 40% increase in the extent of hedges by 2050, and that was recommended by the UK Climate Change Committee. We welcomed the first ever hedgerow target in the Environmental Improvement Plan in January 23, which said that farmers we supported to create or restore 30,000 miles of hedgerows by 2037. So we're, getting close to that time, really, aren't we? And a total of 45,000 miles by 2050. So I think with that target, obviously how that is deliverable is the big challenge. So earlier this year, CPRE published research to show where the government hedgerow target could be delivered. So many of you will have heard of the Natural England's National Character Area profiles. So that was used by our researchers to identify the areas around the country that were of highest priority for hedgerow planting and restoration. So it looked at like the condition of hedgerows, information in these profiles. It looked at historical cover, and it also looked at policy support. So, for example, was there something in the NCA profile that said things should happen, or was there a countryside stewardship statement of priority, including hedgerows? So that was the criteria. There were 8 areas of the country, a lot of them in Yorkshire, that were the absolute highest priority identified, but there were 40 areas that were identified as being, the most opportunistic areas for hedgerow restoration and planting, and of course rejuvenation, Nigel. So now, thinking about recommendations for government. So within the risk research, we were saying that the government needs to target where action is needed to best deliver these national hedgerow targets. So we've got the National Land Use Framework. We're expecting that early next year, rumour has it. So there could be something in there about hedgerows. And also the need to develop a system for monitoring progress towards the 2037 and 2050 targets, hedgerow targets. The issue, of course, at the moment, as Lisa's research has showed, is that agri-environment schemes are not having a massive, massive impact on hedgerow planting, restoration, rejuvenation at the moment. So it's a core issue in how these targets can be achieved. And then also about making access to government funding opportunities as straightforward as possible to ensure a higher uptake of these offers. Certainly we've heard some of our hedgerow hero projects that landowners who are involved in some of them see involvement in these projects as a positive way to actually get involved with the planting or restoration without having the bureaucracy of paperwork. So that's another issue there. I mentioned earlier about the hedgerows regulation. So this is protecting important hedgerows. So back in 2010, we surveyed English local authorities. So, CPRE, I should say as well. I mean, largely our focus is England. So we surveyed English local authorities and how they were going to implement the hedgerows regulations. So basically, if there was somebody who applied, for example, a farmer applied to remove a section of hedgerow, then they should apply to the local authority for permission to do so. But of course, there are challenges, and so that came up from local authorities. So one of the ideas of how that could be improved is, so that hedgerows, if they're not 30 metres long, which is the criteria for being under the hedgerows regulations, 30 metres long, 20 metres long, 30 years old, and then the national criteria, that there was a need for a local landscape criterion. So hedges which are important to local landscape character could then be saved by the local authority, even if they don't meet the existing current criteria, because then that would mean local landscape character, newer hedgerows could then be protected. But one of the key issues is that full planning permission overrides the hedgerows regulations. So sometimes I'm contacted by people who are saying, oh my goodness, there's developments happening, what can we do? Is there hedgerow protection? And the fact is that currently the hedgerows regulations are overridden. But then on the other hand, you have government policy which says biodiversity net gain, we're going to create habitat. So that really is a problem for protecting existing hedgerows. And, a solution, of course, an ideal world would be that development would work within the landscape instead of against it. So the importance of local planning and policy making that actually looks to protect and enhance existing hedgerows that are there, and trees, of course, as well, and the other landscape features, instead of development basically going over, drilling them all out. So absolutely agree with Lisa, with Nigel, that there needs to be a big increase in efforts to plant, restore and rejuvenate hedges to turn the tide. Clearly, what we have at the moment, with the lack of take-up for hedgerow options in agri-environment, that not showing in the results as having a significant impact, that's a huge problem, isn't it? And that needs to be solved. And I know we always say, oh, we need more money for X, Y, Z, more resources, but that really is going to be part of the solution, how this is deliverable, how these hedgerow targets, government's hedgerow targets, are deliverable.
Great.
Of course,
Emma,
we'll want a brighter future for hedgerows. Thank you.
excellent. Perfect. Thank you. And then we'll move over to Jaques Baudry from France, an eminent landscape ecologist, one of the first people to research hedgerows from a landscape ecological perspective in the early 1980s. And I'm wondering what Jaques makes from the UK research and condition of hedgerows right now with his French and international perspective. Jaques.
First, thank you, Mark, for the invitation, and Lisa for the presentation. It was very interesting. Well, maybe I can introduce myself. I work, before doing research, I work as a planner in land consolidation programs to how to maintain hedgerow networks. So I have the practical side as well. And well, I'm quite familiar with hedgerows in UK or Great Britain. I never know how you have so many strange ways with your geography. First, when I met Bob, and then I came for several seminars and even met Max Hooper in Monkswood. The really first place where hedgerows have been studied, which is quite interesting. And well, so, I wrote this paper with Richard Foreman about hedgerow and hedgerow networks in landscape ecology, where we put forward some ideas of the functioning of networks. The paper has no data, but it's the concepts are still valid, and I think it's interesting. When I've been doing in France research, I set up with many colleagues a long-term ecological research site on bocage, hedgerow networks, different networks, and to see what are the consequences of having different hedgerow and networks patterns, especially. And because we had view from geographers, many ecologists, hydrologists, biogeochemists, remote sensing, law, social sciences, history, and even photography. And well, we worked like this since 1993 we started. And okay, so for the points for the discussion, I have 3 points. And first, I think it's very good that the countryside survey is going on some form. Of course, it's changing, but to have real data on hedgerow maintenance, removal, state, and so on. And that's something most of the time we are lacking, because when it comes to hedgerows, there are many, you have more believers than people without data. So that's even if with all the uncertainties. And the second point is, well, something I knew and I've experienced in Ireland last year is the difference in the representation and the role of hedgerows in France and in UK and Ireland. And that's because for you, that's mainly property line, and they have to be stock proof and to have biodiversity. Though I noticed that the carbon sequestration is coming in, because in France, because probably we have farm of very different size, a different history of farming, the production of firewood, the production of timber from hedgerows is something very important and something that is really increasing. So the good condition of hedgerows in the two countries would be something very, very different. And I think that's important because in the scientific literature, it's barely noticed that hedgerows from different places are different, especially with all those EU projects where you have data from different places and people say hedgerows, but they don't mean that it's different. And so that's probably something to notice. And but you are in a good position to show how to present those hedgerows in good condition. So I think probably that's something to be not discussed, not today, but probably if someone has time to discuss about this, what hedgerows and the cultural context in Europe or even broader like this. The third point is, as a landscape ecologist, I'm always frustrated because in this type of assessment, the assessment of the quality of the network is absent. And I wonder if there is, Lisa, any point in the future to assess the quality of networks in terms of connectivity, because to say that I've been through the book, the 70 pages of the good condition of hedgerows, and it says that density can be a proxy for connectivity, but I don't think so. But density is like all landscape metrics, is scale dependent. So density over a country, over a farm, over a land class doesn't mean the same thing. So to actually study the landscape pattern would be important. And my question is, do you have, what kind of mapping, how do you map hedgerows beyond the 1 square kilometer cells? Do you have kind of mapping, or do you use aerial photograph, or do you use satellite images or LiDAR images? LiDAR is good, but it's expensive and complicated. Because in France, now we have maps of hedgerows with 8 of hedgerows coming from aerial photographs. And so we have hedgerows that are, for us, 2 meters will be very low. So we have this kind of information, and we have also in the map, of course, we have the gaps, so we can assess the quality over large areas. And well, it's convenient respect when you want to assess something about the windbreaks, the microclimatic effect, and so on. So that's a question about mapping and about what can we do to protect hedgerows. Of course, in France, we have also schemes where people can receive subsidies to maintain their hedgerows, and etc. But I want just to present 2 things that are important. We have now a label, and it's called Label A, which in French means the beautiful hedgerow. But and this label, farmers have to pay to have the label, and so they have so they know the state of their hedgerows, and they have also advices on planning over 10-year period, how to improve, how to manage, how to cut wood for firewood, and so on. So it's really a process where they have the advisors to help them to maintain their hedgerows. And this label is used also in 2, as far as I know, in 2 different ways. We have more and more group of municipalities, people creating some kind of association to buy firewood to the local farmers. And in some of this association, and it's coming, if farmers have the label for their hedgerows, they get a higher price. So that means that the consumers are paying to protect biodiversity, so they are involved in their local biodiversity, which I think is a good thing. The other things we have is that we have, of course, the annual big agricultural show in Paris with cows, wine, cheeses, and so on, and a lot of plaques that are distributed to people. And since, I think, almost 10 years, there is also a contest for agroforestry, and in Western France, agroforestry is bocage. And so the contest goes at the regional or local level. Farmers that apply, they are visited, and the assessment is the quality of hedgerows, but also how hedgerows are important in the production system. And it can be in either stock farms or crop farms, and how farmers explain what they do and how they get involved, how they replant, how they regenerate, and that's something. And then the first at the regional level, they it goes up to the national level, where we have also of course a comparison. And I've been involved in this for 5 years, and I think it's very good, because what we have is that we have very, very different farms. At the beginning, I was quite afraid that there would be a good way to, but no, we have very different farmers doing very different things. And so that shows that, for instance, farmers planting hedgerows to have their paddocks for grazing, and putting in trees as fodder and things like this. So that's make, of course, what they get is the only option and over. It's only a plaque, but they are proud, and they can be proud to explain what they do. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jaques. And I like the idea of prizes for agroforestry or for hedgerow quality as part of the village show culture in the UK. I don't know whether that's happening anywhere, or is something that would be sort of accepted by the probably quite conservative village show organizers, but I think that's a wonderful idea. Great, so we have a little bit of time left for questions from the audience, and people who feel comfortable doing so can maybe turn on their webcams now as well, so that we have some more folk on the screen. There's been quite a lively chat going on, but maybe we can just see whether anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question to any of the speakers, so that Lisa and the panel as well. Well, maybe in anticipation of any, there, Vanessa, go ahead.
Yeah, very simple one, but I just had a question for Lisa on the lack of surveying in Scotland. What's the main kind of driver of that at the moment, do you think?
I can't say. I don't really know. They just haven't refunded Countryside Survey. I think they're probably looking to other methods to look at state of hedgerows, which is tricky. I know that there is a lot of EO data out there which can give a good picture of where woody features are, but I don't think there's too much evidence that they can give you the kind of condition measures that you would get from ground-based survey. So the trees outside of woodland work comes from forest research in Scotland. Maybe they feel that it's possible to make an estimate of change in features using that. I'm just not sure. It's a policy decision, really.
Beth.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone. This has been really good. Jaques helpfully answered my question in the chat, but in case, I thought Nigel might have a view as well around, like as you said, Nigel, it's such a small part, hedgelaying, such a small part of the current picture. Do you think there's any chance of purely from a sort of skills and interest and capacity perspective, do you think there's any chance of a rejuvenation of the craft of hedgelaying to sort of a level that would make a significant impact on hedge management, in a similar way, I suppose, that the stone walling as a craft was kind of rejuvenated by HLS? Or do you think we're starting from such a low base in terms of the number of professional craftspeople and land managers that are sort of interested and able to do it, that it's not really ignoring the fact it would need significant investment, just from a skills and capacity perspective?
No, very good question. And indeed, the agri-environment schemes over the last probably 20 or more years have really encouraged the rejuvenation, as you call it, of hedge laying. So the National Hedge Laying Society is a very healthy organisation. You can find local contractors on a map there. They're trying to set up accreditation schemes, but also apprenticeship schemes, which are very important. I guess when you look back into the past, hedges had a purpose, which was the stock-proof barrier, and farms had many more people working on them, so that labour was there. Hedge laying is a seasonal job, winter work, so whoever takes it up has to be aware that they need that summer income stream as well. Apprenticeships definitely needed. We've got to be certain that these grants, which we're talking so much about, continue. We've got this cycle of 5 years of government, and we can see that things can change just like that. So anybody going into the industry's got to kind of know that hopefully that will keep going. I think what is helping is this knowledge of this life cycle management. And so if farmers get it into their head that all their hedges, they've got to rejuvenate each one of those in their tenure, it's 40 or 50 years. And if we've got it in our mind about this life cycle of a hedge, at the moment, I think we've lost about 1.5 generations of people. So since the mechanical flail came in 1950, 1960s, we've forgotten all about this whole process of rejuvenation because we don't need the stock-proof barrier. So as we reintroduce that, we have to encourage people to lay more hedges, and also coppicing is a very valid form of hedgerow management as well. So I'm reasonably confident that it's chicken and egg. The work's got to be there for people to go into it, kind of thing.
Great.
Thank you.
And Adrian.
It's actually quite a related question. If we were to increase the amount of hedges, there's a lot more planting, say, in the next 10 years, we manage to stimulate that, then the thing that exercises my mind is we're generating a whole bunch of maintenance need. And where's that get us? How do we resolve that? And it sounds like the answer to the previous question is part of the answer there.
Shall I kick off with that one? Or?
Go ahead.
It's a very good point, and the planting targets are huge, really. But just as a side point I'm not quite sure where we're going to get all the plants from, because the nursery growers in Britain are fast declining. So I hope we don't import everything and all the associated problems. We do definitely have to look at and educate people in the post-planting management of hedges. There is none of that at the moment. People just plant the hedge, and then if you look at them in 20 years' time, I don't think they're offering much. They're trimmed off at 1.5 meters like everything else, and they're not doing much. So definitely we can't just have targets without figuring out where we're getting the plants from and figuring out how we're going to manage them. So it's all part of this big push and an education that we need to do to people planting the hedgerows to say we have to manage these, and this is how you're going to do it.
Well, can I just add that, yeah, I think that the contractors are really key too. They do a lot of management, and they haven't really been talked to before. So in this project, we had an astounding response from contractors because they were asked, and that they could be managing those young hedges if they knew what they were doing, and they were advised to manage them well right from relatively early on. Then that could be a real win. So there's a sort of education gap there. Most contractors told us they only learned how to drive the tractor and how to angle the head on the flail so that it didn't get damaged.
Megan, go ahead.
Hi, Lisa. It's a question about the margins. At the moment, we've got an ongoing consultation about how we're going to be enforcing the new hedgerow legislation, much of which pertains to the sort of 2-metre buffer zone. And I was wondering whether the most recent countryside survey update had any information about how many hedgerows failed their favourable condition because of the margin management and that lack of that, potentially that 2-metre buffer zone not actually being maintained.
Yeah, we have that data. We had it for 2007. It was never picked up on or used. So, yeah, I don't know what we do with that. The RPA, if the RPA want to know that very few farmers, or a relatively small proportion of farmers will reach cross-compliance, or whatever the new term is, we could certainly tell them that.
I think it would be very helpful at the moment, as we're all putting in our consultation responses, to have some stats and figures that we can use to demonstrate the consequences of potentially a reduced regulatory impact.
Agreed. Yeah,
forward.
I'll certainly help with that.
Pete, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lisa, for your presentation. Nice to see some countryside survey results. Brought back some nightmares. I was.
You mean nice memories, don't you, Pete? Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, I think I've recovered from 2007 now, I think. I was just thinking, because I've been teaching a lot on biodiversity net gain recently, about urban hedges, and of course they will be missed out from the countryside survey squares because we never went anywhere near urban or peri-urban, and in particular hedgerows that were in the countryside but are now within new housing estates and that sort of thing, because they are retained with new developments. They don't tend to be got rid of. So you get these native hedgerows in amongst housing estates now. And some of them get some very odd management. I saw one in Norfolk, which looked like it had been espaliered. It was about 50 centimeters thick, and, but was still there as a native hedgerow. And I was wondering how we can bring data in from somewhere to include with the countryside survey data, perhaps. Anyone, any ideas?
I can say that we did actually encounter one or two of those hedges where our surveyors actually said, well, it's still here, but it's houses, but the hedge is still there. But it's going to be very small proportion of what we cover. So, yeah, I don't think we'll be able to, CS will be able to say very much about that. But I don't know if there's other ways of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, in BNG, there's a difference between the methodologies as well, because there's a thing called ornamental hedgerow, and they can be native species. So a beech hedge, a hornbeam hedge would count as an ornamental hedgerow and not as a native hedgerow as it would in the hedgerow survey handbook, I think, which could cause some issues.
Make an interesting project at some point. I'm going to move on to Mary for the final question, and then we'll close today's lecture. Mary, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. This is I found this all quite overwhelming. I'm a retired languages teacher, and I've just joined a small environmental group in South Oxfordshire, and you know, we were just wondering what can a small volunteer group do, and we were also thinking about carrying out a hedgerow survey of our village and its environs, and I wondered if you've got any advice for us. Is there anything we can do?
Nigel, I think you're got your hand up with. Go ahead.
Well, quite by chance, I live in South Oxfordshire, and my small town started to do a hedgerow survey in the parish based on the protocol from People's Trust for Endangered Species and my 1 to 10 scale and various things like that. And I was brought in to help, and at first I thought, oh, it's another thing to do. But actually it was the most fantastic experience. It really brought people together. We had about 40 volunteers. We had good access to local landowners, which may not always be the case, but we did. We had fantastic access to. We taught them how to ID hedgerows. Great project. We've done management, hedge laying, coppicing, planting up, and lots of people have come out. And we found it a really inspiring way to involve parishes, and I think it's taken off. Megan will know more about this than me, but it's sort of taken off all over the country quite well. So really something to try and promote.
Mary, perhaps you can reach out to Nigel afterwards, and he can put you in touch with some of the people who've initiated the work that he was involved in.
That would be super. Yes, please.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And what a nice way to end the Bunce lecture and the questions. We have hit 4:31, which is 1 minute later, and Bob Bunce would be disappointed in my timekeeping. But a huge thanks to Lisa, Nigel, Emma, and Jaques for all your insights and all the time, especially Lisa for the time preparing the lecture, and it was all very insightful. I hope you all enjoyed today's lecture. There was at one point nearly, I think, 84, 85 people on the webinar, so that's a great number. The chat in the so the written chat, but also the questions showed that you're all very engaged. You will all receive one email after this event with a link to the recording in case you want to share it or rewatch it. And in that email, we'll also plug our new website and tell you a bit about the upcoming conference in Edinburgh this summer on landscape scale monitoring. And hedgerows could be part of that conference, especially if Lisa or one of her colleagues or someone else here in the audience decides to submit an abstract. If you want to keep up to date on what we do with ialeUK, our other webinars and other activities, of course you can join us. We would love that, but you can also follow us on LinkedIn. We do announce all our events there. We were on Twitter until recently, and we're contemplating whether we'll join another social media platform. But for now, LinkedIn is the only way that we're active on social media. We'll have a 7 or 8 minute break and start with the ialeUK annual meeting at 16:40. So that's in 7 minutes. So anyone who wants to hang around, and especially hopefully the committee members, we will all be here in 7 minutes time to talk through what we've been doing over the last year and our plans for the coming year. But on that note, thank you everyone, and I hope you had a good afternoon and hope to see you again sometime soon.